Hi, guys. Over the past few sessions, we've been talking about dealing with doubts. And I'd like to pick up on that theme again. I have a lot to say about this topic. I'm pretty well acquainted with it. I consider myself somewhat an expert in the field, both from the standpoint of working through and resolving those doubts, but also from the standpoint of struggling with doubts myself long before I became a Christian. I had many doubts that I thought were just insuperable, and that the Christians that I was talking with at the time, that I really didn't expect for them to have any good answers to what I thought were pretty sophisticated objections. But come to find out, my objections were pretty basic and run of the mill. But I, as time went on, even long into my Christian walk, is that I struggled with doubts on a variety of topics. So as I've said before, that I finally decided that I am going to figure out why I believe what I believe or quit believing it. And over the last 50 years, last 50 years, I've been researching these types of issues. And tonight, what I'd like to do is share with you some thoughts about Christ's resurrection. And so, and the reason why I want to talk about Christ's resurrection is because it's a fact that, at least the claim that Christ resurrected from the dead is a fact that everybody who is a thinking person has to give an account for. And we have to decide whether or not our explanation for that event accords with the evidence that supports it. And so we will do that tonight as we go through and give some consideration to this whole matter. I'm old enough to remember the trial of the century, at least in last century, and that was the O.J. Simpson trial. And the big question that everybody was considering, and it seemed like, it became this television event that people consumed on a regular basis. And the big question that everybody was considering was, did O.J. do it? Now, did O.J. murder Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman? That was the question that people were considering at the time. Plenty of people have an opinion about this case, but who knows for certain whether or not O.J. did it? Well, at the time of the trial of the century, there was only one person who knew for certain if O.J. did it, and that was O.J. Simpson himself. All the rest of us had to draw our conclusions based on the evidence and the arguments that both the prosecution and the defense offered. And of course, we have the picture here of O.J. Struggling to get that the infamous bloody glove on his hand that was covered already with some surgical gloves there. When it comes to the evidence for Christ's resurrection, that we have a variety of facts that we could consult with respect to Christ's resurrection. But what we will do is that we're going to focus our attention on just 4 different facts, and they all begin with the letter E, and that includes the claim that Jesus was executed, the claim that his tomb was empty, the claim that eyewitnesses said that they saw him resurrected from the dead, and that saw him alive after his death, and also the early testimony about this event being a part of the Christian message. So we're going to look at each one of these because I think that, upon first glance, they may not look to be that significant. But the more that we we dive into them, I think that you're going to begin to see a narrative developing that gives us important considerations to ponder with respect to Christ's resurrection. So let's talk about this evidence. And the first strand of evidence that we want to consider tonight is the execution or the death of Christ. Now, people may offer alternative theories to Christ's resurrection, but any alternative theory must account for all the facts in evidence. And these various facts, and I'm just listing 4 here. There's others that could be considered. But these various facts is that, well, if you claim that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then what do you do with his execution? And we'll see how these connect in a minute. If you claim that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, what are you going to say? How do you explain the empty tomb? If you say that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, how are you going to explain the eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen him after his death by crucifixion, claimed to have seen him alive after his death by crucifixion? And if you if you say that, well, the resurrection is just a story that people made up, then how do you account for the early testimony with respect to Jesus's resurrection? So the evidence, you see, it's not like Christians have one set of evidence and skeptics have a different set of evidence. Is that all thinking people have the same body of evidence to consider, and really where they differ is with respect to the interpretation of that evidence. So here's what the experts say about Jesus' death, and most scholars in the field of New Testament studies. And I want you to get clear about this idea of scholars in the field of New Testament studies. Just because a person is a scholar in New Testament studies doesn't mean that they are Christian. As a matter of fact, some of the more notable scholars in New Testament studies are skeptics, agnostics, Jewish believers in Judaism, and a wide variety of personal commitments, including people who are Christians. And so once again, it's not that Christians have a different set of facts, is that we have to examine the evidence and see where that takes us. Now, let's go back to this idea and consider what the experts say. And most scholars in the field of New Testament studies, including atheists and non-Christians, believe that Jesus actually lived and was crucified. So the execution of Jesus is largely uncontroversial and uncontested. You're going to get some internet atheists and trolls who think that they are, have something important to say about this, but they're not bona fide experts. It's one thing to be a person who promotes or publishes some YouTube videos, and it's quite a different thing to be someone who is a trained scholar and a trained and published scholar in that field of study. Now, Bart Ehrman is an atheist, and he says this about the existence of Jesus. He says that Jesus certainly did exist, as virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees. So he says there's no question about it that Jesus existed. I remember many years ago, I went to a debate with a colleague of mine featuring Madeleine Murray O'Hair. And some of you may remember that name, but she was a very bombastic and powerful speaker, and she would take on different people in debates. And her basic claim was that Jesus never existed. But that's been debunked so many times over that it's just such a worn out claim that, and as Bart Ehrman says here, is that virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees that Jesus existed. And then there's another scholar by the name of Maurice Casey who says that the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the best attested facts in ancient history. So as we begin to think through these matters, we begin to see that the case can be made. At least we're starting to kind of lay the foundation for the case of whether or not Jesus truly rose from the dead. So we talked a little bit about the fact of the execution of Christ, and I think that we can take it as a settled fact of history that Jesus actually lived and was crucified during the reign of Pontius Pilate. So the second question that we come to is how do we explain the empty tomb of Jesus? And what the skeptics say is that, different people have different alternative theories about why the tomb is empty. And following Christ's resurrection, even the enemies of Christianity had their explanation for the empty tomb, which, by the way, is kind of a tacit agreement or acknowledgement that the tomb itself was truly empty. Why come up with an alternative explanation unless the tomb is truly empty? And we read in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verses 12 through 15, when the chief priests, we're talking about the Jewish priests here, it says, when the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did what they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So once again, there are plenty of alternative theories about why the tomb was empty. Is that, and I'll give just a list of some of them that I can recall off the top of my head. Is that the women, when they went to the tomb of Jesus on the first day of the week, they actually went to the wrong tomb. So there's the wrong tomb theory. Of course, why did people keep going back to the wrong tomb over and over again? Is one of the problems with that. That another issue, another alternative theory, is that Jesus wasn't really dead, and that when he was placed into the tomb, in the cool of that tomb, he revived and somehow pushed the stone away from the inside, given his nail-pierced hands and feet and the gaping wound in his side where the soldier had stuck the spear in to verify his death. And so he extracted himself. So that's the swoon theory is what that's called. And, I don't think that it takes much thought, much serious thought to debunk that. I can't imagine how Jesus would even convince his followers that he had resurrected from the dead, limping around. I know what it's like I know what it's like to have an ingrown toenail, and how much that will impair my ability to function sometimes. And you can imagine having been impaled on the cross and also experiencing a mortal wound by a spear How in the world could you convince anybody that you were the victorious risen Christ is beyond, it just stretches the limits of belief. And so there's other theories about it, but as we see here in this text, is that one of the popular ones is that the disciples stole the body. And we'll take a closer look at that in just a moment. But it is one of the very earliest ones, that this whole Christian thing about Jesus rising from the dead is somehow a vast conspiracy. So let's go on and think a little bit more about that. But wait a minute. Just like what this lady says, is that all this doesn't prove that Jesus resurrected. So far, we've just talked about the execution of Jesus and the empty tomb, but that doesn't mean that he resurrected from the dead. And you're right, that doesn't mean that he resurrected from the dead. But remember, what we need to do is that we need to consider all the evidence and see how it fits with what we know, and not just think in terms of a portion of it. Because certainly the execution, the crucifixion of Jesus, is not sufficient to make the case for the resurrection, nor is the empty tomb sufficient to make the case for the resurrection. But we shouldn't be surprised by this, because this is often the case for any time we're examining an issue that is related to a historical fact that we are not there to consider it. And almost every court case is like that, is that you're not there to consider, just like with the O.J. Simpson trial, is that none of us were eyewitnesses to the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. And so we weren't eyewitnesses to that event. And so we have to just go on the evidence, the cumulative case of the various strands of evidence. So let's see if we can build this case a little bit further. And I think that if I had to select one strand of evidence, to me, that is truly the most compelling, is this one with respect to the eyewitnesses. Now, a lot of people, like I say, they offer alternative theories to Christ's resurrection, but any alternative theory must account for all the facts and evidence. And one of the facts in evidence is that there are a lot of people who claimed to have seen the risen Lord. And so what are we going to do with these eyewitnesses? What's a good explanation of them? A lot of times people who are unfamiliar with the gospel accounts and the Christian sources, that they don't understand the true significance of these eyewitnesses. And let's just give a little bit of thought to that, because there are two types of eyewitnesses when it comes to Jesus' resurrection. And one is that what we could call maybe sympathetic eyewitnesses, and the others were skeptical eyewitnesses. And people like to say, well, it's because the disciples wanted to believe that Jesus was still alive, and that's why they claimed to have seen him. And that explanation is only going to take you so far on a counterclaim to this whole matter, or the significance of the eyewitnesses. Certainly, the believers saw Jesus over a period, the resurrected Christ, over a period of 40 days. One of the things we have to ask ourselves is that why did those appearances suddenly stop after 40 days? That seems to be a curious fact that we need some sort of explanation for. Now, the fact of the matter is that these appearances of Jesus happened at various times and places, sometimes indoors in locked rooms, and at other times outside, and sometimes in the city of Jerusalem, and other times in Galilee, and different places. And on one occasion, sometimes to individuals or a very small group of people, and on at least one occasion Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time. Now, there's certainly sympathetic eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Christ, but we are also going to have to explain if we're going to come up with an account, an alternative account for the resurrection, is that how do we explain then the skeptical eyewitnesses, people who were unbelievers, people who were hostile to Christianity, people who were unsympathetic to Jesus? And we have two key eyewitnesses that fit into that category, and one is James, who is Jesus' half-brother. You can read about that in the Gospels, and that Jesus had other siblings. Mary and Joseph had other children, and that James, and they were skeptical. They were skeptical about Jesus during his life, but after his death and resurrection, James actually became a leading figure in the Jerusalem church. He's also the guy who wrote the book of James in the New Testament. And he plays a very significant role in early Christianity, and particularly in Jerusalem itself. But then we have the notorious Saul of Tarsus, who is also known as Paul, who ultimately went on to write about half of the New Testament that we have by volume. And of the 27 books in the New Testament that Paul wrote, if I remember right, and of course now I'm on the spot, but I think he wrote 12 of those 27 books in the New Testament that are attributed to him. And he, early on in his career, he was a persecutor of Christians, and he was rabidly opposed to the message or the early church, and putting Christians both in jail and also killing them. But we have to ask ourselves, how do we account for his testimony that he encountered the risen Christ? And that event completely turned his life around, and as a result, he became certainly the most, I would say, arguably the most powerful Christian leader in all of human history. So there are two types of eyewitnesses. There are the sympathetic eyewitnesses and the skeptical eyewitnesses. And we have to explain, there has to be some sort of explanation. There has to be an explanation for the death of Christ, that he was really dead and wasn't just unconscious. That an explanation that the tomb in which he was laid, that was found to be empty on the third day following his execution. And then all of a sudden, that people are starting to have these encounters with the risen Christ, including James somewhere along the line, and the man who eventually became the Apostle Paul. And now, another interesting fact about the eyewitnesses is that the very first eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Christ were women. Now, in the cultural context of first century Judaism, women were generally not considered reliable witnesses in legal or historical matters. Now, why is that significant? Well, here's why. If the resurrection story had been fabricated, the authors would likely have chosen male witnesses, and even credible male witnesses, like the Apostle Peter or the Apostle John, or someone who has a little bit of street cred amongst the early Christians. But instead, we have these women who are the first, and actually the very first woman to witness the risen Christ was a woman of what was, her reputation is that she was a woman of a questionable character. So her life turned around while she was following Jesus, but she is a woman with a past. So if you're going to make up a story, why in the world would you lead with women as being the eyewitnesses, particularly given the reality of that culture? And so that the fact that women are named as the first witnesses suggests that the story was not made up, because inventors of the story would not have chosen a detail that would undermine their case. And furthermore, when it comes to this whole issue of resurrection, you have to think in terms of the cultural context, the historical and cultural context in which the resurrection is claimed to have taken place. And the expectation of Jewish believers was that the whole idea of an individual rising before the end of time was just not on their radar. So in first century Judaism, the resurrection was primarily understood as a collective event to occur at the end of the world. The idea that a single individual would rise from the dead before this universal resurrection was completely foreign to Jewish thought at the time. Jesus' resurrection then came as a surprise because it was an individual resurrection occurring before the final resurrection at the end of time. And so, when you stop and think about it, if you're going to make something up, it's going to be a pretty hard sell for the followers of Christ to lead with women witnesses, a hard sell to the culture of their day. And they would lead with women witnesses and also claim this individual resurrected before the universal final resurrection of all humanity. So there is a quote by Dr. William Lane Craig. He is the man that I volunteer for his organization, Reasonable Faith. And it says, the apostles were willing to die for their belief in the resurrection of Jesus. They were not willing to die for a known lie. The fact that they died as martyrs strongly supports the historicity of the resurrection. Maybe another way to put that is that people will die for what they believe is true, but who knew for a fact if Jesus resurrected from the dead? Well, certainly these men who claimed to have been eyewitnesses, they knew for a fact if that was something that actually happened or something, or a conspiracy that they just foisted upon this unsuspecting public. And so people will die for something that they believe is true, but I can't imagine a whole group of men dying for what they know is false. What they truly know is false. And so we have to give some weight to at least that explanation about the eyewitnesses. So I think that this whole thing about the eyewitnesses is pretty for me. I think it's like the most compelling piece of the puzzle here, because some dismiss the eyewitness accounts of Christ's resurrection as being mere hallucinations by grief-stricken disciples, But think more carefully about these eyewitnesses. As Dr. Craig says, hallucinations cannot explain the appearances of the risen Jesus. Hallucinations are subjective, individual experiences, but Jesus appeared to groups of people on multiple occasions, including skeptics like James and Paul. These conversions are best explained by genuine encounters with the risen Christ. So here's a little quiz I'd like to end with, and just in our last consideration here, is that where do we find the earliest account of Christ's resurrection? Is it in the Gospels, the writings of Paul, the writings of the Apostle Peter, the sermons in the book of Acts, or some other source? Well, the answer to that question is that the earliest account of Christ's resurrection is found in a creedal statement, so a quote that the Apostle Paul is referencing in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7. And many experts in New Testament studies believe that this passage contains a very early creed that Paul is referencing. Why is this significant? Let me just build the case here real quick, and then we'll wrap up. So, you see, many New Testament scholars date this creed that's embedded within the book of 1 Corinthians. That the 1 Corinthians was written sometime in the 50s, and so it's about like 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion. However, the creed was developed earlier than the book of 1 Corinthians itself. And many scholars date that creed, and I've gone through and I've followed the argumentation for it, and I find it very compelling. You're welcome to kind of like go down that rabbit hole for yourself. But many scholars date that creed to within a few years after Jesus' death, possibly as early as within 3 to 5 years. And some actually place it within months or a year of Jesus' death. Well, so what? Well, the creed in 1 Corinthians, as Craig Keener says, a highly respected scholar, he says that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is so early that it reflects tradition circulating within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, making it extremely unlikely that these accounts were myths or fabrication. You know, it's one thing to make up a story when no one can fact check you, but it's quite a different thing when in your story you are attributing experiences and testimony and events of living witnesses or living persons. And so certainly they could kind of come along and fact check you on that. And so the evidence, and so the point of all of this is that the claim that Jesus resurrected from the dead is that you can go back into the Christian, you can peel back all the layers of that onion as far as you can go, and you find that there's nowhere in the Christian accounts where we have the Christian where there is no claim to the resurrection. So in other words, Christianity started from its very beginnings with the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. So there are a number of facts that support the belief in Christ's resurrection. And these 4 different items give us good reasons to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Fact number 1, Jesus was as dead could be. He was executed under Pontius Pilate, and then he was placed in a borrowed tomb, and that tomb was found to be empty after 3 days. There are a number of eyewitnesses who claimed to see the risen Christ. And among those eyewitnesses are encountered among those eyewitnesses are people who are sympathetic to the Christian cause and people who were skeptical or even in opposition, persecutors of the Christian cause. And then we find that this claim of the resurrection is part of the Christian preaching from the very earliest times in the record of the church. So that gets down to the final slide here, and that's just simply this: is that I guess it's almost the final slide, the penultimate slide. Penultimate is that when it comes to the consequence of Christ's resurrection, well, it is of some consequence to get the correct answer to the question, did O.J. do it? I mean, in other words, it serves justice and society, and it serves the families and others to get the answer to that question, did O.J. do it? That is of some consequence, but it is of personal and eternal consequence to get the right answer to the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? I guess at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, what do I think about this? Here's what Paul says in the book of Romans, chapter 10, verse number 9. He says, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And I know for myself that I had to kind of clear away the cobwebs of doubt in my thinking for me to have the assurance of committing my life to following Christ. And I think that at least we've scratched the surface here tonight to give you some good reasons why it makes sense to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Let me encourage you to check out some of Dr. Craig's resources on. He has a few different YouTube channels, and one of them he has his animated videos on there. And all you have to do is search in YouTube. You can just search William Lane Craig animated videos, and he has a whole host of animated videos there that are very well done, that will help you to answer some of the basic questions or some of the, I guess, important questions that you might have about Christ, Christianity, and the existence of God, the reliability of the Bible, and so on. I appreciate you so much taking some time to watch this video, and I'm going to share some more videos along the way about my journey to dealing with doubts. But I hope that tonight that this was beneficial for you. I'm Pastor Kerry Decker, and this is my series of dealing with doubts. I hope to talk to you or visit with you next time. Bye-bye